Sometimes to truly make a change, you have to do something big, something dramatic, and something that ensures that you never go back to the emotional and physical traps that have made you so unhappy. One of the best days of my life was the day I smashed my scale. I loved it so much, I think we should all do it. And to make rejecting diet culture even more exciting, I'm giving away free advice and prizes, including a full year of body kindness coaching with me. So to join, visit bodykindnessbook.com/BK Scale Smash. That's bodykindnessbook.com/BK Scale Smash. There you give your name and email and you'll get the motivational coaching from me. Lots of ideas for how you can participate right there on the page. And I look forward to joining you all summer long while we work together to just tell the world that we don't need scales, we don't need judgment, we don't need criticism. What we need is body kindness. Because real health is about being good to yourself. It's time for Body Kindness, the place where all bodies fit and weight is just a number. Hi, I'm Rebecca Scritchfield, author of the book Body Kindness, registered dietitian, nutritionist, certified exercise physiologist, and host of this podcast. My topic today is not all eating disorders are to the bone. And by that subject, you may guess that I discussed the Netflix movie To the Bone, which actually was received poorly by many of those who are treating people who are in recovery from eating disorders, especially people who work with marginalized populations. So I wanted to let the documentary come out, watch it myself, and then have a conversation with someone who I've known for years. And I'm so excited to introduce her to you today. If you don't already know, the wonderful Chevese Turner. Chevese Turner founded the Binge Eating Disorder Association, or BEDA, in June of 2008, recognizing the need for an organization to advocate on behalf of individuals affected by binge eating disorder and the providers who treat them. Turner's well-rounded career in the healthcare, pharmaceutical, political, and nonprofit arenas, as well as her many leadership roles within these fields, prepared her to launch BEDA, which is the only organization specifically suited to support individuals and treatment professionals managing BED, or binge eating disorder. And if you don't have some familiarity with binge eating disorder, you're going to learn a lot about it in this episode as well. To the Bone ended up being a very small part of our conversation, but there's really this gradual build up to why people would find this movie challenging. And we were having such an important conversation about missed opportunities in eating disorder treatment and recovery, and why that is. And there's multiple factors that affect people, keep them from getting the help and support that they need. And so you're definitely going to want to tune in and listen to this, even if you don't identify as someone who's in recovery from an eating disorder. We all know somebody, but even if you're thinking, well, I don't really know anyone, should I listen to this show? I'm not sure what's in it for me. It's going to open up your eyes, because you're going to see, culturally, that there are, things aren't always what they seem. So, one of the biggest takeaways is that, an eating disorder does not look like what we often portray it as, which is a rich, thin, white woman's disease. And that is at a disservice to many of the people who are struggling with an eating disorder and struggling to be taken seriously. And frankly, even struggling with coping with the fact that there may be something, going on that is actually an eating disorder, and just resisting that idea so much that they don't even seek treatment. And often people who struggle with binge eating disorder may even be seeking treatment for dieting and weight loss, which can make the disorder worse. So we even addressed food addiction in here briefly. So there's gonna be something for everybody in this show. And, so just have a listen, and just, what I would encourage you to do, if you're working on your own body kindness practice, I think that if you listen to this show and just acknowledge what is being said, and even if you are not someone who struggles with an eating disorder, maybe think about how culture sets us up for hating our bodies and wanting to change them, and how, just because people aren't necessarily like you doesn't mean that they don't suffer or lack in access. So I really think that opening up our eyes to a lot of the bigger picture things that influence our individual choices is also a very important part of how we practice body kindness for ourselves and also toward others. So with that, I hope you enjoy our conversation. Welcome, Chevese, to the show. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm thrilled to be here.
Well, why don't we just dive right in? I'd love for you to share with the listeners a little bit more about yourself and the type of work that you're currently doing.
Okay, great. I'm happy to. I am Chevese Turner, and I'm the founder and CEO of the Binge Eating Disorder Association. And so as you can probably imagine, that's my full-time gig. And I spend a lot of time working on issues that are relevant to people with binge eating disorder, who are the most common folks who have eating disorders, and all of the issues that intersect with that particular eating disorder. One of the intersections is, of course, people living in higher weight bodies and all that goes with that. People with BED, while the majority are not in quote unquote obese bodies, the majority are in normal weight or overweight bodies. There is a portion of this community who are in obese bodies. And I hope you're okay with it. I actually fine with the word fat. And so I would rather refer to people in bodies like mine as fat. So if that works for you, Rebecca, that's how I'm going to go forward.
Yeah, no, that absolutely works for me. And in fact, you bring up an interesting point, because I have learned from fat activists and people such as yourself, that exact point was that to take the power back for the meaning of that word just as a descriptor. And I know Roxane Gay, who wrote Hunger, which is a bestseller, she even tweeted out, look, this is just a description. And fat activists for years have been working on embracing the word fat. And on social media, I, as someone who, there are a lot of people in large bodies in my inner circle. I mean, people I would lay down on the line for. And so for me, whenever I hear the word fat as a dig at people or in a negative way, it hurts me personally. Yeah. And I very much identify as an ally to people in large bodies. Mm-hmm. And with that, I guess, sense of importance to support the reclaiming of the word, sometimes on social media, I will, reshare some great activism. And there was one that I did where I was kind of asking people to share with something like, who are the fierce and fearless fatties you look up to? And it was like in quotes. And anyway, there was one I know was a dietitian, and she just basically said like, oh, I would never use that word. And it was interesting. I asked more people like, please comment. I always want to learn, but my understanding and my use and in the context of this message was all positive and empowering as my intention. And so Bottom line is, it was hard for me to decipher, was this person not up to speed on how to re-embrace the meaning of the word fat to be more powerful, or, oh crap, am I not allowed to use the word fat because culture sees it as a negative word? And a body kindness reader in a large body said, because I know you and I know what you're about, I don't feel hurt by this.
Right.
But if I don't know someone who is not in a large body and I don't yet trust them, I might have a hard time not feeling hurt by this. So it was just real interesting to me, because you think you're doing good and your intention is to help and do good, but to also respect that a person has to have a certain amount of trust in you.
Yes.
So could you add to that to help educate listeners and even me more to help enlighten on kind of what's going on there? So the importance of reclaiming the word, but also that people have to actually feel that you mean empowerment by what you're doing?
Yeah, I think reclaiming the word is about taking it back. It's taking away the negative aspects of the word, and it's reclaiming it. It's saying this is just a state of being. This is the English word for a state of being. And but it is fully loaded. It comes fully loaded for people who are not in higher weight bodies, who have thin privilege. And so, it would be the same as me using a word that is used in the Black or brown community. Even though I see myself as an ally, it's not appropriate for me to use those words unless, people from that community tell me it's okay. So I would never dream of using those words anyway, because there's still so much stigma and just awful connotations that are left with those words. But I think that the word fat, within the fat community, when we tell you it's okay to use it, if that's coming from a fat person, then it's okay to use it. I think that there are many, the majority of fat people are not comfortable using that word because we've been told that, obesity is the proper word to use, or, whatever else it is. And they have so much internalized stigma around their body size that fat still feels really awful to them. And I mean, all of us in higher weight bodies have been made fun of for being. So it's difficult. It's difficult to navigate. But I think that, just asking a person is probably the best way to go. And I also just want to acknowledge, before we get any further, that I want to acknowledge my own privileges, because I am a cisgendered, white, straight female who happens to be in a higher weight body. And I've got a lot of privileges outside of being fat and female. So I just want to acknowledge that before we go forward.
Yeah, no, that's very important, and something that I hear frequently, to consistently acknowledge your privilege, and I appreciate that. I personally don't think I do that enough. But as I'm actually redoing my counseling practice website, and I'm always kind of tweaking stuff with a podcast. And I was like, I really think that there are places where I could be more consistent about acknowledging privilege, and need to work on that myself. So I appreciate you kind of guiding me in that direction.
Sure, yeah, we forget about our privilege, and so for me, it's a way to remember. Okay,
right. This is the frame. So what led you to become the founder of Binge Eating Disorder Association? I mean, that's not a small feat to create something from nothing. So how did you get to that point in your life?
Well, part of it was privilege, and part of it just was my own journey, and being, frankly, just really disgusted that every time I engaged in any sort of eating disorder activity, whether it was a conference or a meeting or talking to a clinician or talking to people with eating disorders, I never saw anyone that looked like me in terms of body size. And the thin privilege that sort of permeated the eating disorders community was just so palatable that it was really a very uncomfortable place for me to be. And I knew that I had an eating disorder that was not talked about very often. That the point that I began the organization, it wasn't included in the DSM-4 at the time. And I knew that in order for people like me to have any sort of credibility within the eating disorders community, much less the healthcare community or the community at large, that we would need to have that diagnosis. And so my privilege was that I was in a job in which I was a stockholder, and I quit that job. I took that money and I started this organization. And the way that I see it now is that it truly was a gift to myself, because it really allowed me to do the final steps of my own recovery and get to a place where I could actually say, you know what, I'm I'm pretty much recovered. This just isn't such a big deal. But what was so interesting and what led to the eventual additions to BEDA's mission, or I don't want to necessarily say mission, but the platforms that we were going to utilize, and the issues that we were going to address, was I began to really learn that there was this culture of thin privilege, which basically said to people like myself, you're not welcome here. You're different. You are what we fear. You are what we don't want to become. And your eating disorder is not as serious. It doesn't need to be taken as seriously. All kinds of underpinnings. Clinicians who were still struggling with their own eating disorders and internalized weight stigma. All of these things I was running up against, and so were others who eventually came into the BEDA fold. And we realized that we really needed to begin to call this out, to name it, and to really begin to talk about it.
Yeah. I mean, and it really is amazing if you think about it. It hasn't, how long has binge eating disorder even been recognized in the eating disorder community as its own mental health issue?
Well, this is what's really sad. Dr. Albert Stunkard at University of Pennsylvania identified binge eating disorder in the late 1950s. It did not make it into the DSM-5 until 2013.
Oh my God.
And there's lots of reasons why, but to this day, I remain convinced that part of it was weight stigma, and knowing that this is a group of people that are going to show up in higher weight bodies. And, the answer is not going to be to just put them on a diet or help them with weight management or that sort of thing. So it really has served as an unjust amount of time that people have had to deal with these disorders. It's not just binge eating disorder. It's, atypical anorexia, in which people are at higher weights, and bulimia, and, across the board, there are many of us who are in higher weight bodies and suffering from eating disorders.
Yeah. Well, and that brings up a really good point, because I think there are a lot of myths and misconceptions about eating disorders in general, but even, specifically to binge eating disorder, I think that there's things that people don't know about it that they should know, right? Just a general lack of information. What would you say are some of the key things that people, like, what would you want everyone to know about binge eating disorder?
Yeah. Two of them I've already stated in a way. One is that it's the most common eating disorder by a long shot. And that most people with binge eating disorder are actually not in fat or super fat bodies. So those are two. The other piece is that binge eating disorder is not all about binge eating. There is a lot of restriction that goes along with binge eating disorder. So, to talk about this disorder as if it's only binge eating is incorrect. The cycles of binging and restriction that people go through with this disorder is part of the reason why there's so much distress. And it takes over your entire life. You have to work at it very, very hard in terms to just do the eating disorder, because there's so much restriction that goes alongside, and that's this overwhelming thought that we need to have willpower and not binge. There are people with binge eating disorder who are underweight. I think people find that hard to believe. Let's see. People with binge eating disorder do most of this in secret. This is not someone sitting in front of their family at the dinner table, just, eating a lot of food. It is mostly done in secret. And there are a lot of subjective binges that come with this. I know that the the DSM-5 description of binge eating disorder is an objectively large amount of food in a short amount of time. But there is sort of the flip side of that goes along with it as well, and that's a subjective amount of food that makes the person, I guess I'm not saying it right, but a subjectively large amount of food. That's the way it feels to a person when they're eating that food. For example, I used to binge on Oreos, and so if I would have just one or two Oreos, I immediately went into binge mine. That I had done something terrible. I had just binged. I ate 2 Oreo cookies, and that would bring up all of the feelings and the discomfort that I had even when I was engaged in a large binge. So, the amount of food is important in terms of the diagnosis, but it's really not. So I think that that's a big misperception, that people really think that people with binge eating disorder are sitting in every single binge is, 15,000 calories. That's just not the way it works.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's really opening my own eyes, and I'm recalling, hearing from several readers of Body Kindness, or we had this Facebook group, and I mean, and they're trying really hard to let go of dieting and release from the grips of diet culture, but we know how hard that is. And there's people who are working on permission to eat, and there is a lot of this. It looks and feels very disordered based on how what they're eating is making them feel, because the context is off, right? It's not like, oh, I want to, enjoy something, and today it's Oreos, and here's me happily eating, whether it's 2 or a row. There's a certain joy and permission and feeling good about it that would be part of normal eating. Or even if my mood's off and I'm choosing to soothe with food, I know that's one of my choice options. And so it's not that you always have to be happy when you're eating Oreos, but then there's what you're saying, which is, yes, for the diagnosis, there is a volume component, but there's also this component of, even if it's a smaller volume, if it feels like the negative emotion and the shame, if it feels painful or traumatizing, like as if it would have been a larger volume, that's still engaging with the eating disorder. That's still eating disorder behavior.
Yes. And it's, if you have an eating disorder, it's eating disorder behavior. And I think that so many times what happens in those moments when it's actually a small amount of food, it comes with all of the feelings of shame and, what am I doing? And my stomach feels really big now, and I feel lethargic, and all of these things. And that may actually, if those feelings then may set you up for an actual larger binge after you've had those 2 cookies or whatever it is, because you are at that point then distressed and decide to go on to a larger binge. So I do think that is important for clinicians, especially to know that a much smaller amount of food can do the exact same thing, and providing their clients with tools around what to do if that does happen. Because, if you go on to a larger binge, okay, it is what it is. That's part of recovery is finding these things out and going through them and being able to say, okay, I needed to do that at this point, and maybe the next time you won't. But being able to acknowledge that, okay, this was a subjective binge. It set me up for something else. What's going on here that I can acknowledge and work through. And it's all that shame, and it's that dieting mentality of, oh my God, I can't have 2 Oreo cookies, So it's complicated, and in an eating disorder brain. I also, I do, and please note that I am not a clinician. I hang around with a lot of clinicians, and I read a lot of research. But we all know how much that stress plays a role in eating disorders. And I think some of these subjective binges that then turn into larger binges sometimes gets caught up in sort of the food addiction model that we can't control ourselves. Once I have one or two cookies, I can't control myself. And so I think we have to just be careful about instantly labeling that as somebody who has a food addiction. And we need to think about what else is going on when people are coming into contact with these types of foods, and then move on to a larger binging or all day grazing or whatever it may be. We've got to really, understand what it's doing to us emotionally as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And to my knowledge, I know that there is not agreement as to whether or not food addiction even has enough evidence to actually, exist. It's like, yeah. But even among the well-rounded science-based researchers who would be on the side of believing that there's something there to it, which isn't a majority.
Yeah.
But there are a few reasonable people that I can think of. And one, his name is escaping me, but he's a male dietitian, which is also rare. And we've had a couple of interesting conversations. I know he's been published, and he acknowledged with me, he's like, even, those who are supporting this model, like basically we acknowledge that way many more people think they have it than actually do because of diet culture. So, you're talking the person that's trying to advocate for, look, food addiction is real, and here's how you show that it's not eating disorder, because that's where what I mostly see are people who think like, oh, I don't have binge eating disorder. I just need to lose weight. I don't have binge eating disorder. I just can't eat sugar. My body can't handle it. It's like they're actually not getting the treatment for the underlying issues for what they really need. Mm-hmm. And so here's somebody who's trying to support and advocate for the fact that there is a model for food addiction that's outside of eating disorders. And I would not say I align with that belief system at all. Mm-hmm. But when you can have an honest, frank conversation about it, there are people who support the idea of food addiction who will acknowledge you have to rule out eating disorder first. And then secondly, there are people with an agenda pushing food addiction out of fear. And that's just diet culture crap, right? And that people who aren't trying to be in that group, they get that you'd have 100 people saying, I have food addiction, and maybe one person actually does, if even that. And so that to me is very important, because if you're just going off of what's in your social media feed or what you're reading in the headlines or books that are out, you're going to believe that food addiction is actually a real thing. But to know that there's a divide as to whether or not there's enough evidence. And even in the people that support there's evidence, they fully acknowledge you have to rule out eating disorders, and it would not nearly be as prevalent as people would think, that their real issue is either eating disorder or disordered eating, body image, diet culture, BS camp, right? Somewhere in that group.
Well, and what's interesting is the most of the calls that we get at BEDA that are from men are really trying to grapple with this, because men do not want to be associated with an eating disorder. So it's much easier for them to say, I have food addiction. And they feel more comfortable with that. And so I think that, at some point, really being able to connect with men who have binge eating disorder, especially because we know that many more men have binge eating disorder than any other type of eating disorder. It's about a 60-40 split, with women having about 60% and men 40% of the overall individuals who are affected. And if men are not willing to accept that they have an eating disorder and will only say that they have a food addiction, that's a problem because they're not going to be getting the proper treatments. So we need to be, talking about men and their eating disorders and not making it, that eating disorders only affect women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, that is going to be a huge challenge to face because, there's just the shame around having an eating disorder in general, but shame around having a quote woman's disease or woman's issue that then becomes another barrier for people getting the care that they need. And I think for the benefit of the listeners understanding, at least on one level, if they were to follow a food addiction type of treatment, it's going to be along the lines of something like OA, Overeaters Anonymous. Their treatment model is abstinence, which actually, if they have binge eating disorder, would trigger binging.
Right, because again, binge eating disorder comes with a lot of restriction, and restriction sets up the binge. Not all the time, but a lot of the time. And so I know people who have, OA has varying degrees of abstinence, Food Addiction Anonymous, FA, they have their own food plan and so forth. And it is very much an abstinence model, which, you can talk to thousands and probably millions of people who have tried that, who actually have binge eating disorder, and it has been disastrous. So it just entrenches the eating disorder and is not a great idea for someone who has true binge eating disorder or any other type of eating disorder.
Okay. Yeah. So to recap kind of where we've been so far. So we've talked about people in different sized bodies dealing with different types of eating disorders, and not necessarily people in large bodies have binge eating disorder. We've talked about men who aren't necessarily seeking treatment or who might not be getting the right treatment for binge eating disorder or another eating disorder. What about people of color?
So what we know about people of color with binge eating disorder, and that includes Black and brown folks, Latino, Hispanic, Black individuals, whether they're African American or otherwise, they actually have the highest rates of binge eating disorder. White women are not the highest rates. It's Black and brown women and men. So again, when you look at the eating disorders community, and you know this, Rebecca, because you've been to our conferences and so forth, you look out into the audience, it's all white people. It's primarily women, and it's primarily thin. Even at our conference, the Binge Eating Disorder Association conference, because a lot of clinicians come, and they are mostly thin. So there is such a discrepancy between who is affected by these eating disorders and who is treating them, who's showing up in them, and so forth. So and there's many reasons for that, but there are studies that are being done now that are in primarily communities of color and in low socioeconomic communities as well, that are showing extremely high rates of binge eating disorder and trauma along with the binge eating disorder. So we'll have a lot more information about that at our conference this year, but we know this, and we have to do a much better job of bringing that community into the fold, and that starts at the top. In our case, making a true effort to bring people into leadership and making space for them at the conference and getting them there when, economics could be an issue and so forth. So there's a lot of work to be done. And across the eating disorder spectrum, those who are affected they're not who you see in articles and, movies and so forth.
Yeah. I mean, it is unbelievable to hear that the people who are providing the care don't look like the people who they're needing to serve. And that, you have to have diversity among care providers, but it also can matter to a person who's trying to get help where they don't necessarily feel that they can connect with the person who's providing the help. And it makes sense to me. And until it was pointed out that you're just in a sea of thin white women, like that, oh my gosh, this doesn't make any sense. This is a problem because you can't even, you can be the most empathic person in the world, but you don't have the embodiment of their lived experience where you can connect through features, and that matters in positive psychology. Like it's not something that we can even control, but a subconscious ability to connect with other people based on a shared history and shared experiences. And I know for me, although I keep kind of talking about it, not taking action. So I'm going to say it again. And I'm just like, okay, you can at least send an email. But I went for nutrition as a career change. I worked while I was studying. And so I needed to go to school in DC. And it's very, you have to get an accredited program. And I ended up going to the University of the District of Columbia for my nutrition. And it's a historically Black college.
Yep.
And I am on the advisory board, and I do what I'm told to help make sure it's Katie approved and all this stuff that we're supposed to do as part of the advisory board. And I'm like, I really want to bring to the board how we're going to work with the students and get help to see the students throughout, from completing the nutrition program to getting their dietetic internship and then going in and working in eating disorder recovery, because it's a huge gap.
It's a huge gap. And I will be honest when I say, and I'm working with consultants, I'm taking classes, which are very humbling around, diversity and inclusion. And all of these things are, I thought I was so open and recognized so many issues in our culture, but I had really only skimmed the surface. So really bringing people in, asking them to come in, and also giving them the space to make sure that they're working in a way that is, true to their heritage and their background and so forth, and having their voice at the table and accepting that voice is going to be different. It's going to make the organization different. It's not always going to be comfortable. And that sort of thing is, those of us who have grown up with white privilege, it's pretty uncomfortable, and I'll name that for myself. But it just, to me, it means we need to keep doing it. So having that type of position that you have and working to encourage people to get into eating disorders, for my organization, we'll be right here for them if they're interested. So that's great.
Yeah, I will definitely make sure that I take action and make sure to help kind of provide the resources once I can have a better understanding of gaps. And part of it could be just even, when you look at the nutrition curriculum, it doesn't scream eating disorder treatment, because most of what they teach dietitians is how to give people body image and problems.
Yes,
they teach us dieting. So there's a lot of muck that we have to fix, I think, among nutrition professionals. But even I have an exercise credential too, and so I'm just like, why am I not more vocal among the exercise community about health at every size and just that whole area of where I could be more helpful. So as you're talking about doing your personal challenging work, I'm right there with you. And I think that's a product of where you do see where you're able to make a difference, but then that opens your mind to, okay, there's more good work that could be done. So what's the next important thing that's important for me to focus on that really helps me accomplish the bigger picture goal of why you started BEDA,
And that's true, because sometimes I have to sort of stop and question and say, are we going down this road where it's too much mission creep, or, are we not focusing on the right things? But to me, making sure that everyone with this disorder has, access to good care, access to that care being paid for, and it doesn't matter, who you are, what you look like, what skin you're in, any of that. You deserve those things. I just want to make sure that everyone is getting help. And with that comes all these social justice issues, because that's the nature of healthcare and mental health care, that it is not equal. There are definitely people who are outside the system and not getting care. And in this case, they actually happen to be the majority.
Mm-hmm. Right. So, and really all this leads up to something that is happening currently, which is, why would literally hundreds, if not thousands, of people who work in this line of advocacy, treatment providers, people such as yourself who run organizations for eating disorders, why we would all get in a tizzy over the Netflix movie To the Bone, which came out recently. And I know you saw the preview, the trailer, and I did watch it. But for the benefit of the listeners, which I think we should just say, I'll share a link to something in the show notes where you could learn a little bit more, and that, we're not necessarily saying go and watch the movie. So I am bringing this up from the standpoint of, there's so much out about that. And you may have heard that people were saying this movie shouldn't have been done, or I'm really angry about this movie. And I think our conversation so far points to a clear, rational reason for why people should feel that way. So I'm just curious, what can you share with me about what you heard about the movie and how you feel about it, and why?
Well, I will say that at first I was a little more upset about it than I am now. And I think it's because I did have the time to sit back and think about the fact that this is one woman's story. And she is telling it from her viewpoint. And she is also, from my understanding, is that her actual treatment and the days where she was actually in her eating disorder were some years ago, when treatment and how eating disorders were looked upon were even worse than today. There was very little acknowledgement of them. And so when we think about it that way, you do have to say that this is just one woman's interpretation, and it's her story, so it belongs to her. And all of the realities of that story were portrayed, as I understand it, in the movie. Coming to it from the lens that I typically have today, and thinking about my dream eating disorders movie, would it be this one? Definitely not. But I can't slight her for telling her very own story. It is her words, her interpretation. So I think that we'll never see anything from Hollywood that really shows the full eating disorder experience. We would like to, in that it's multifaceted and just is not as most people think about it. But going forward, the issue of eating disorders and just getting any recognition is still something that we're working toward, because we've come a long way, but eating disorders are still so misunderstood. They're unrecognized, they're undertreated, and they're killing people. And they're killing people of all ages, all sizes, all cultures, and socioeconomic backgrounds, sexual preference, gender, that you name it, people are dying because of these issues. And so while I have mixed feelings about the movie itself, I do respect that it, again, is one woman's viewpoint, and we as advocates have to really be out there saying, okay, this is what it is. And, and that's one of the things some of my training recently has taught me to do, is that we need to keep using the word and instead of but.
I'm going to write that down, because I have heard that before in trainings, and I have to say I am still probably more of a but person.
Right, me too. I want to say yes, but we still need to do this and this and this,
right.
but
Yeah.
and we
Yes.
still need to keep fighting and showing people how they don't have to live this way.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say that I do appreciate hearing your take, and I agree with you 100%. The movie is one person's story from a time in her life, it's based on a true story, but it's not all true. And yes, the treatment has come a long way, but it still has very far to go, because as we started with earlier, people aren't even necessarily seeking treatment. There is a very high cost to getting treatment, which means only the most privileged people who are seeking treatment can really get it. And I had read somewhere that when the film was being shopped around with other outlets, people were saying things like, just not really important enough issue. Just doesn't really affect, enough people. And I'm like thinking, really? So yes, on the one hand, be grateful that there's something else out there to hold on to that's getting some attention and conversation about it. But I think based on our conversation today, also sort of, and I think what the grumblings have been are like, okay, do we really need a thin cis white women's take on, with the title to the bone and this single picture of look how emaciated this person is, and with concerns about, oh, well, I'm fine, as we talked about. And it's very frequent with my clients. They don't look like they're about to die. They don't look like they're about to faint in the hospital. I mean, I have had people who were that bad, and for their health and well-being, they need higher level of care right away. But there are a lot of people that need a higher level of care who don't look that way. And so to me, it's this, if you hope to make a difference with this movie, then do your best to make a difference, and not just getting it on Netflix, but how could it be used as a tool? And I personally think one of her missed opportunities was in the scripting. There were a couple parts where she exhibited weight stigma, and one was when she was having this conversation. They were having a conversation about eating, and it's like the mistake that no helping professional should ever make, but a conversation of like sort of, oh, what are you afraid you're gonna get so big you have to be removed from a house? Or, it was something along those lines of like, oh, don't worry, that's not gonna happen. And but even saying that, like when I watched that part, it stung and it hurt me. And I thought, I think the movie could have made a point without adding to shame and stigma of any size body. So
I 100% agree. And I think that's just symptomatic of there's so much of that amongst eating disorder clinicians, much less families and individuals with the disorder. So, every day we hear about, people who've been told, don't worry, you won't get fat when being refed or whatever. And, what if you do?
Right. Yeah.
What if you do become fat? I mean, it really is missed opportunity, and it is very stigmatizing.
Right. It is. And I've gotten to the point to where I just keep saying in every scenario, what's wrong with fat? There is nothing wrong with fat. There is nothing wrong with being a fat person. Like the more I'm able to say that with heart and conviction, and with not being afraid if the person will disagree with me, it's just here it is. Yeah. Well, I definitely want to make sure we talk about the upcoming binge eating disorder conferences. Your conferences are always great, and this year you're doing something interesting as you're partnering up with Anita. So can you tell me a little bit more about the event, what you have planned, and who would be possibly interested in attending?
Yeah. Yeah, well, usually, and this year is no exception. The people that come to the conference are, of course, we have clinicians who treat eating disorders. There may be clinicians who don't have a full-time practice in eating disorders alone, but they want to continue to learn about how to treat properly. Any healthcare provider out there, because every single healthcare provider is seeing people with eating disorders. They probably don't believe that, but they are. And then, of course, family members of someone with an eating disorder, spouses, siblings, friends, whoever is interested and wants to be there to be helpful. And then, of course, individuals who may be struggling with an eating disorder or are in recovery. Pretty much anyone who has anything to do with an eating disorder, we would welcome. So the conference this year is in New York, in Brooklyn, and it's on November 2nd through the 4th. And I am very excited about our partnership with NEDA. NEDA was not going to do a conference this year because they're going through a big strategic planning process, which is really great, and decided to join with us and to work together on our conference. And I'm very excited about this. NEDA also serves people with binge eating disorder, and Claire Misko, who is their CEO, is really also very dedicated to expelling these myths, getting the word out, increasing advocacy efforts and awareness, but also leveling the playing field for people with eating disorders so that we really know who has them, who is not being treated, and understanding that the reflection of the eating disorders community today is not the true reflection of who is affected and who needs treatment. And so I feel like I have a true partner in leadership in terms of somebody who really is interested in broadening the people who are at the table and whom we're serving. So that's really great. And I think that this conference will reflect that. We are making headway into bringing people to the table. We still have a long way to go. But our primary keynote is going to be done by a group out of San Antonio who has been working in food swamps and food deserts and really seeing that these places where there's not enough food for people and the food that is there is very homogeneous in terms of the contents of that food. And how many people have eating disorders in these places where typically we only see research about quote unquote obesity. So I think that's going to be extremely eye-opening to our community and help us understand where we need to go moving forward.
I'm so excited. I can't wait to attend. I'm so excited to be there and to learn and grow. And I have learned so much at the BEDA conferences throughout the years. And this year in particular, it does sound like if you want to be cutting edge, and you don't have to have the full blown practice out, but you just want to get some cutting edge knowledge, especially with this idea of the intersections. Like, we're not just like a siloed person, we're complex individuals with complex factors that make us who we are. And if you're really going to help people, you have to start to understand some of these intersectionalities and complexities that make recovery from an eating disorder very, very difficult in our current culture. And so that way you can be part of making it better.
It will be. It will be. I'm confident.
Yeah. So before we wrap up here today, I would love it if you could share, if somebody has been listening and saying, maybe I have some, like, I don't know if it's binge eating disorder, but gosh, I do feel like there are times where it feels like a binge or I have a lot of guilt or shame. Where would be that first stop to really kind of self-checks? They don't have a care team, no diagnosis, but they're just curious about maybe there's something more to their quote emotional eating, or I just need to lose weight. What should they do first?
Yeah. First of all, I want to, you brought up a word that I want to address, emotional eating, and let folks know that emotional eating is actually normal. And we use that because so many people themselves will say, oh, I was eating emotionally, and everyone eats emotionally. So it really is normal. But if you feel like there's an issue, then you're probably beyond emotional eating. And that is okay. And there is help available. I would suggest first, of course, going to our website, which is BEDA Online. And I know that Rebecca will provide the link to that. But just reading some information on our website, Googling binge eating disorder, seeing what else is out there, people telling them stories. Anyone who tells you that they have a pill or a diet or anything like that that is going to cure their binge eating disorder is a snake oil salesperson. So please, when you're on the internet, don't believe those things. So that's very important to watch out for. But generally going to an organization that works on eating disorders advocacy is a place where you can find information about the disorder. You can also feel free to call us, and of course, we can give you further information and chat with you about this. Looking for a clinician in your area that might be willing to talk to you for a couple of minutes prior to setting up an appointment and just get a feeling if this is something that is worth seeking treatment. But I would say if your gut tells you that it's worth seeking treatment, then it is. I sort of denied it for years and just kept going through weight loss programs. And, I finally figured out that I was just in this cycle that was never going to end until I got the right treatment. So that really is the key.
Yeah. And, I think even if, again, not expecting that you're like, oh, here I am, fully ready to embrace eating disorder, fully ready to let go of diet culture, fully ready to, embrace all of it and whatever body that lands me in. Like, don't wait for that magic moment to happen, but no. it's like one thing at a time. Be curious enough about your well-being to know that what you're doing is kind of like a diet, rock bottom, right? Yeah. To be curious enough about what you're doing that there's something better, and take the first step and the next step and the next step. Like,
it really is like going through stages of grief, because you are grieving first, perhaps that, you can't do your dieting right, and that you have something more than just, a lack of willpower, and you get angry, and there are times you're going to give up and you're going to stop looking for treatment and go back on diets. It's this whole process. So anyone that thinks they're not doing it right is actually incorrect. There is no right way, and it is a process, and it's much like grieving, because what you're grieving often in this disorder is what society has told you have to do, and it's really quite wrong. And to get past that takes a lot of work, but it is so worth it, and it is very achievable.
Yeah, and we need to end on that positive message of hope and confidence. We will be confident for you if you don't feel confident enough yourself that full recovery is possible, and a happier, healthier life is possible that is free from the oppressive diet culture that we live in. And, it's not that it's a perfect utopia type of a life, that there are challenges, but it's way better than what you were dealing with before, and much, much more joy and satisfaction that comes along with it.
Definitely.
So before we wrap, just let us know the website for BEDA.
It is www.bedaonline.com.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I had a great time chatting with you.
Thank you. You too.
And that's our show. Thank you so much for listening. I would love if you could take a minute and leave a rating and review on iTunes. I know they don't make it very easy, so I have a few quick tips for you. First, launch the Apple Podcast app, and then you're gonna click the search button to enter the name Body Kindness, and you'll find my podcast. You'll see the album art. And when you click on the album art, there is going to be a button in the middle at the top. It's called Reviews. Click that. And then when you scroll to the bottom, you will see an option to leave a review. And so you'll click that button and go ahead and write your thoughts. I also would love ideas for future episodes. You can email me, Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com. Again, that's Rebecca@bodykindnessbook.com. I love chatting about the show and how it's helpful. And so keep those emails coming. And also, if you are not yet completed with the e-course, don't forget that's a free resource for anyone who's interested in practicing body kindness. If you visit bodykindnessbook.com and click on Get Started, just enter in your name and email and you'll get instant access. I'll see you there.